Hi, my name's Liv and this is The Criminal Construct. Before we get started, I have someone to introduce. This right here is Daisy. She is my emotional support dog. I love her so much. Clearly, she loves me too. She's just going to sit here, so if you hear any licking sounds, it's more than likely going to be her. I wanted to start this channel for quite a while, and I didn't really know what would be the best case to start with, and I didn't think there would be anything better than talking about the Zodiac Killer. He is the most, well, we say he, we don't know for certain, but I think the likelihood is it's probably a man, is the most infamous serial killer that is in American history. I do have some notes here just so that I don't get anything wrong, i.e. names, dates, things like that, because I want to make sure that this video is factual. So we will go from there. So if you're into true crime, deep dives, a bit of psychological analysis here and there, then you're in the right place. This isn't about retelling cases, it's about understanding them and understanding the motives behind the serial killer, why they do what they do. So instead of diving straight into the mystery and the ciphers and all of that, I want to start with the victims. At the end of the day, this is a real story. These people were real, and I think we need to remember that, because a lot of people forget that, and that is the most important part of these cases. I also want to say that if you are not in the right headspace to listen to something that has such sensitive topics involved, please go find a different video. Please find something a little bit more light-hearted and take care of yourselves. So it all began on December 20th in 1968. David Faraday, who was 17 at the time, and Betty Lou Jensen, who was 16, were on their first little date. They were just teenagers. David was a little bit shy, he was polite, he was an all-round good kind of guy. Betty Lou, she was confident, she was smart, she was full of life, she had so much future ahead of her, just as David did. And they drove out to Lake Herman Road, which is well known as Lover's Lane. This was a quiet place, it was remote, it was somewhere that people would go to talk, listen to the radio, maybe even get a little bit of a cheeky kiss if they were lucky. But at some point in this night, another car pulled up, and no one really knows what was said, if anything was said at all, but somebody decided to suddenly get out of this car and just shoot David in the head, and he was gone. Betty Lou realised what was happening, she tried to get out, she tried to run, but she was shot 5 times in the back and she was left there to die. It was cold-blooded, there was no real motive, nobody knows why this happened, and that's what made this entirely so much more scary. And these just 2 kids who had so much life in front of them were just taken away. And then on July 4th of 1969, yes, it was Independence Day, 22-year-old Darlene Ferrin and 19-year-old Michael McGew were parked up at Blue Rock Springs Park. Darlene was married, she had a young daughter, and she was just one of those people that everybody seemed to like. And then there was Michael, who was Darlene's friend. They were parked up, they were chatting, they might have even been watching the fireworks that were being released due to it being Independence Day, and then a car pulled up behind them. This car stayed for a while and then it left. And then, unfortunately, that car decided to drive back. Suddenly, the driver got out and he shone a torch into their car, almost as if he was a police officer doing a routine check. And without warning, this guy decided to just start shooting. Darlene was hit multiple times. She passed away later on in hospital, and Michael was badly wounded, but he luckily survived, and that's why we know what happened during this event. The killer then decided that he wanted to call the police himself and confess to these murders, or what he thought would be a double murder, and he also confessed to the 2 previous murders, as if he wanted credit, which we know serial killers love to have credit. They hate it when anyone else takes credit for what they have done, so I'm sure that's the reason why he wanted to make sure he was the one to get there first and make sure that he had credit for what he had done. Then on September 27th of 1969 in Lake Berryessa, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepherd, both who were college students, were having a nice little picnic. It was a quiet and peaceful spot, and they were just lying on a blanket near the lake when a random man decided to approach them. He was wearing this really strange costume. He had this like black hood over his head, kind of like looking like an executioner. And he also had this white symbol on his chest, which was a circle with like a crosshairs through it. He decided to tell them that he was an escaped convict, that he was going to rob them. He wanted their car and their money. And he said that he needed them to lay down, and he tied them up to make sure that they couldn't escape. At this point, Brian tried to negotiate things, saying that he could take his car, he could take his money, just let him go. This obviously didn't work. He didn't want their car, he didn't want their money, he wanted their lives, and eventually that's what he took. He decided he was going to stab Cecilia 10 times and then Brian 6. But before leaving, he decided he was going to take a white marker, go to Brian's car, and write Vallejo 12-20-68, 7-4-69, September 27th, 29, by knife, recording what he had done. And he signed it with the same symbol that appeared on his chest. Brian luckily survived, and he was able to recount what had happened, and that's why we know what happened this day. 2 weeks later, in San Francisco, this time it was in the city, it wasn't in a remote area, Paul Stein, a 29-year-old cab driver, decided to pick up a fare. And unfortunately for him, it would be the worst decision that he ever made. There was nothing unusual at first, until they reached Presidio Heights, where the passenger decided to shoot Paul directly, point blank, in his head. He then took a part of Paul Stein's shirt to take away with him. There were a few witnesses to what had happened, or what they presumed was happening. They didn't know exactly what had happened in the car. All they saw was Paul Stein leant over onto his steering wheel, but these kids up in the houses decided to call the police and give a description of the passenger of the car. He walked past 2 police officers who then stopped him because he matched this description somewhat, but they decided to let him go because what the dispatcher had told the police officers was that this was a black man, it wasn't a white man, and so they let him go. And this was probably one of the worst decisions that they could have made, because they just let go a serial killer. A few days after this, he decided to send a piece of Paul Stein's shirt to the San Francisco Chronicle along with a letter. And that's when he introduced himself to the world, saying, "This is the Zodiac speaking." Now, these 5 killings are the ones that are confirmed to be by Zodiac. In his letters, he did say that he had claimed 37 victims. We can't say for sure whether he had or not. He could have done less, he could have done more. There is just no way to prove it. And we'll probably never know how many he actually had killed. But that's the thing about cases like these. It's not just about the mystery, it's about the real people, the people's lives that have been changed by this. It's not just about the victims, it's about the victims' families. And you have to remember that these are real people in real life. This is not just a story, it's just not just words on a page. It's happened, and you need to be aware of that. This is a killer who wanted to be famous for spreading fear. He had a whole city under his control, and he relished in that fact. That is what he wanted. He wanted to be noticed. And then in the next part that we're going to discuss, we're going to look at the letters, the ciphers, the way that he taunted the police throughout his criminal career, and the kind of clues that he left behind. Because this man didn't want to just kill, he wanted to play games, and that's exactly what he did. After the murders, he didn't just disappear like most killers do. He wanted attention, he craved it, he needed it. He wanted to be known. So less than a month after the attack on Darlene Ferrin and Michael McGew, he sent almost 3 identical letters to the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. Each one started with the exact same line, stating, "Dear Editor, I am the killer of the 2 teenagers last Christmas at Lake Herman and the girl on the 4th of July. But the letters wasn't all that he sent. Inside each envelope was 1/3 of the 408 symbol cipher. The Zodiac wanted newspapers to publish it, and warned that if they didn't, he'd kill again. And to make it even more chilling, he signed off these letters with that iconic symbol, the crosshair. Now this cipher, the 408, was solved pretty quickly, within a week. But it wasn't by the police, it wasn't by the FBI, it was by a high school teacher and his wife. Which is pretty good going, I'd say. Donald and Betty Harden, they used basic pattern recognition and common English phrasing to crack it. And that message was horrifying. He said he liked killing people because it is so much fun. It is much more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all. And the rest of it was just kind of full of rambling, twisted thoughts about collecting slaves for the afterlife and how killing gave him the most thrilling experience. But the cipher didn't include his name, the most important thing that the police needed to find out. And that was something he promised to reveal in his next code. But it was in his fourth letter, sent to the San Francisco Examiner, that he officially gave himself the name the Zodiac, starting with, "This is the Zodiac speaking." From that point on, everything he sent was signed the same way, like a twisted brand identity, that persona, the name, the symbol, the calculated way to taunt the police. It wasn't random, it was all about control. Everything he did was controlled. He wanted to control the narrative, control the fear, but most of all, control how people saw him. He wanted them to fear him, and they did. Now, not all of the Zodiac ciphers were cracked. The most infamous one was the Z340, which was sent in November of 1969. That one was unsolved for over 50 years, and it wasn't until recently, in 2020, that was solved. It was solved by a team of amateur code breakers from the US, Australia and Belgium, and they finally cracked it using software tools and just a whole lot of patience. And what it said was quite disappointing. It wasn't like the first cipher. All it said was, "I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me. I am not afraid of the gas chamber." Again, no identity, no real clues, just more bragging and deflection. But there is still one cipher that hasn't been cracked, and that's the Z13. That's the one where he claimed he was going to reveal his identity, but it's only 13 characters long. And experts have said that they believe that it's just a random bunch of letters. It doesn't mean anything, there is nothing really there, it's just something to mess with the investigators, and that kind of would be very on brand for him. So when you look at these letters and the ciphers all together, they tell you a lot about the Zodiac's personality, even more than his actual crimes themselves. He needed power, he thrived on attention, he wasn't just killing for the act of killing. He wanted to play games with the media, with the police, the public. He inserted himself into the investigation and became this ghost-like presence, always one step ahead, always watching. And by giving himself the name the Zodiac, he made himself into a myth, a brand, something bigger than just a man with a gun. And I'm sure in his eyes he made himself into a legend. So not only did he terrify the public with violence, he kept them terrified between the murders just with his words. And that's the part that's often overlooked. The Zodiac wasn't just a killer, he was a psychological terrorist. And you know what, it worked. People didn't feel safe in their cars, they didn't feel safe going on dates, or even sometimes just being at home, because they never knew when he would strike again. And that's exactly what he wanted. But despite all the letters, all the clues, and all the fear that he had created, the Zodiac never got caught. And honestly, some of the biggest reasons for that were down to the police and the way that they handled this investigation. So that's what we're going to look at next. We're going to look at the police response, the missed chances, and why this case, even with the surviving victims and the taunting letters, still remains unsolved today. So you'd think after multiple murders, 2 survivors, and actual letters from the killer, the police would have had everything they needed to catch him. But not quite, because the Zodiac case wasn't handled by one police department. It was split across Vallejo, Napa County, and San Francisco PD, 3 completely separate jurisdictions. And this was in the late 1960s, early 70s, long before digital databases or instant communications between forces. There were different detectives, different procedures, even different case files. So even though the killer was moving across counties, the investigations weren't really joined up in any meaningful way. One of the biggest and most talked about mistakes happened after the murder of Paul Stein, which we've already mentioned, the cab driver in San Francisco. A call came in reporting the shooting, and the dispatcher gave out the wrong suspect description. They told officers they were looking for a black male. The Zodiac was white, so when 2 police officers actually saw the killer walking away from the scene, they just let him go. Let that sink in for a second. The Zodiac was stopped, spoken to, and allowed to walk off into the night because of one error in communication. And that is so important. That is why it is so important to have lines of communication and correct information passed along to the relevant people. And it wasn't just that. There were so many instances where one department had information that others didn't. For example, survivor Michael McGew gave a physical description of the shooter after the Blue Rock Springs attack. And Brian Hartnell, the Lake Berryessa survivor, described the outfit and behaviour of the killer. And that information wasn't properly shared or matched up. There was no official composite sketch created until after Paul Stein's murder, even though witnesses had seen the killer months before. And some of the Zodiac's letters, especially the more bizarre or cryptic ones, weren't taken seriously at first. Can you imagine that happening today? A serial killer sends you a letter and some department just shrugs it off. There was one main suspect that always brought up in the Zodiac discussions, and his name was Arthur Lee Allen. Yeah, he was a very suspicious guy. He lived in Vallejo, had access to the crime areas, and he matched the physical description, and he even told a friend that he wanted to kill people and used the name Zodiac before the letters were ever sent. He also owned a Zodiac brand watch, the exact same one that had the crosshair that the Zodiac used as his signature, as his symbol. But here's the thing. So his handwriting didn't match the letters. His DNA wasn't a match for the envelope samples, or at least the ones that they had tested, and there was never enough to arrest him. So despite how promising he looked and how obsessed some people became with him, it just wasn't enough to prove it. And honestly, that obsession with Allen might have blinded police to other leads too. So why wasn't the Zodiac caught? It wasn't just one mistake, it was a series of them. The lack of coordination between police, the delay in sharing info across jurisdictions, management of witness reports, and maybe even some tunnel vision around specific suspects. And that fact that the Zodiac was careful. He changed up his methods. Guns, knives, different victim profiles, different locations, and that made it hard to profile him traditionally. But what makes this case so frustrating, even decades later, is that it feels solvable. There were witnesses, survivors, letters, evidence, but it just wasn't enough. Or maybe it just wasn't handled the way it should have been. And that's why over 50 years later, people are still trying to figure out who he was. So in the next part, we're going to dig into the Zodiac's profile, not just his physical, but his psychological, because the way he wrote, the way he planned his crimes, and the way that he needed attention, he craved that attention. It tells us something about the kind of person that he really was, and it's very important to know that, to figure out who he was, why he was, and that's what we're going to do next. So when we're profiling a killer, especially someone like the Zodiac, we're trying to build a picture of who they really were, beyond the mask. The goal isn't just to describe what they did, but why they did it. Because every choice a killer makes, the weapon, the victims, the communication, it all says something about what's going on in their mind. So let's start with what we can piece together from his actions. First, he chose random victims, couples in cars, a taxi driver, a college picnic. There's no clear personal motive. That tells us that this wasn't about revenge or jealousy, it was about power. He picked people who were vulnerable in that moment, and that gave him the upper hand. He also changed methods, used guns and knives and varied his location, and that's unusual for a serial killer. Most stick to some sort of pattern. But the Zodiac seemed to intentionally break patterns to avoid predictability. That shows planning, control. He knew how to manipulate the investigation and the fear. Then there's the letters. No other killer at the time was doing this. He wasn't just confessing, he was crafting a public persona. He created a brand, a complete brand with a name and a symbol, and that points to narcissistic traits. He wanted to be famous, that he wanted the world to know who he was, even if they didn't know his real name. The letters are theatrical, confident, sometimes mocking. He refers to himself in third person, almost like he sees himself as a character that he's made. And he wasn't just killing, he was performing. He was putting on a performance for the public eye. And experts believe that the Zodiac was likely a white male, aged 25 to 40 at the time of the crimes, highly intelligent, probably with an above average or reading or writing ability. Someone with a deep sense of resentment, possibly towards women, society or authority, all the above, possibly a loner or someone who struggled socially. His spelling and phrasing suggested someone trying to sound more educated than he actually was, like he wanted to seem superior, and this is how he got noticed. There's also a theory that he may have had paranoid or delusional thinking, especially when he talked about collecting slaves for the afterlife. That kind of belief crosses into psychosis territory. It's not something that the average person is going to be talking about, but then again, serial killers aren't necessarily average people. But what is strange is that the Zodiac showed signs of both calculated logic and chaotic impulse. He was careful in some ways, planning attacks, hiding his identity, but also reckless in others. Killing in public, writing to newspapers, even taunting the police. That contradiction makes it hard to say whether he was a full-blown psychopath, a narcissist, or something else entirely. But one thing is clear. He didn't kill for money, or revenge, or passion. He killed for attention and fear. And even now, decades later, he's still getting exactly what he wanted. So we have a killer who wanted power, who saw murder as entertainment, who wrote himself into history using fear and ink. And yet, for all the clues, all the codes, and all the chaos he caused, we still don't know who he was. And in this next part, we're going to look at the modern theories and the breakthroughs, because in recent years, with new DNA technology and online sleuths getting involved, some people think that we may be closer than ever to finding out who he really is. So, decades passed. The Zodiac case grew cold, but then something happened that no one could have predicted. The internet. And with it, a whole new generation of investigators, amateur sleuths, cryptographers, Reddit threads, YouTube documentaries. People started pulling this case apart in ways that law enforcement just didn't know how to at that time, or the resources to do back then. And to be honest, some of these breakthroughs didn't come from the FBI or the local police. They came from random people at home, driven by obsession, curiosity, and maybe even a need for justice. It may be even someone like me or you who's just interested in serial killers, in true crime, in understanding why people do these things. So let's talk about the Z340 cipher. The one that the Zodiac sent in 1969 that stayed unsolved for over 50 years. We've already discussed that it was finally cracked in 2020 and it wasn't by law enforcement. So it was by a couple of guys who used custom software to test thousands of potential decryption patterns, and we have already discussed the message. But it wasn't a reveal, it wasn't a name, it was just something that could confirm that the Zodiac had been bluffing all along. He hadn't left his name in that code, it was just more ego, more games. But then in 2021, a group called the Case Breakers came forward with a bold claim. That the Zodiac Killer was a man named Gary Francis Post. He was a house painter and a military veteran who died in 2018. They said that they had evidence, a matching scar on his forehead, anagrams in Zodiac ciphers that spelt his name. Well, the thing is with that, you could spell anybody's name given the right letters. So that one's kind of, maybe, maybe not. But there was also alleged links to a cold case murder in Riverside. And here's the thing, most experts and law enforcement officials don't buy it. I personally don't buy it either, but that's a theory that is out there. The FBI said that the case was still open, and local police departments haven't confirmed any conclusive link to Post. So it is a little bit of a stretch, but you can make any name work in a cipher if you try hard enough. So why haven't we just used DNA to solve this? I mean, it's a good question, and it's one that frustrates a lot of people, because there is DNA evidence, but it is limited, and most of it comes from saliva on an envelope, flaps and stamps. And for decades, no one knew if the killer had someone else lick them to avoid being identified, which is also a possibility. The partial profiles that do exist are incomplete. There's not enough for a solid match in most databases. And unlike in the Golden State Killer case, where a strong DNA sample was matched through genealogy, that just hasn't been possible with the Zodiac. At least it hasn't yet. But there has been whispers. In 2023, reports surfaced that San Francisco PD may have retested some of the evidence. There are still a few private labs working on advanced DNA sequencing techniques, but nothing's been confirmed publicly. And maybe that's the most Zodiac thing of all. He remains this massive, looming mystery, right on the edge of being solved, but just out of reach. And so here we are. 5 confirmed murders, possibly dozens more, letters, ciphers, symbols, a killer who turned himself into a brand, and somehow escaped justice. And the truth is, someone out there may know who he was, maybe a family member, maybe a witness who was too afraid to come forward, or maybe he really just did take this secret to the grave. But whether or not we have learned his name, the Zodiac Killer left behind more than just a trail of bodies. He left a mark on history. The Zodiac case is just one of those stories that sticks with you, and it's not just because of the horror of what it was, it's because of the unknowing. We don't know who he was. We don't know how many people he killed, and maybe that's why we keep coming back to it. Maybe that's why the idea of someone committing brutal crimes and telling the world about them and still managing to vanish without a trace is so disturbing. It's also weirdly fascinating, because it leaves you asking how. It leaves you asking, how could this happen in plain sight? And I just want to say thank you if you've made it this far, because for every code, every theory, every creepy letter, there are real people behind this case. David Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, Darlene Ferrin, Cecilia Shepherd, Paul Stein, all of their lives were cut short, and their families never got answers. And that's what true crime should really be about. It should be about the victims. It shouldn't be about the mystery. It should be about remembering those lives that were lost. Will the Zodiac ever be caught? Honestly, I don't know. Maybe not. But what we can keep doing is telling the story carefully, truthfully and respectfully. Because maybe if people understand this, it's unlikely to happen again. And if you found this interesting, or if you're the kind of person who loves going into deep dives and unsolved cases and serial killers, murders, things of that sort, then you are in the right place. The Criminal Constructs is just getting started, and I'll be posting more deep dives soon. And if you want to come with me on that journey, please hit subscribe. Thank you.